The leader of an alleged sex cult has been arrested in Mexico. He's charged with federal sex trafficking.
The so-called self-help guru allegedly coerced women into having sex with him and also branded them as part of an initiation ceremony.
The rise and fall of Keith Raniere and NXIVM is one of the most disturbing scandals of our age. What began as a purported self-help group spiraled into a dark, secretive pit of illicit sex, money laundering, and exploitation.
He wanted to impose his will on people and control people. He mandated this torturing of women. He branded them. He scarred them for life. And I think he took pleasure in that.
Sometimes desperate situations require desperate measures.
After decades ruling a criminal enterprise, Raniere never thought a whistleblower could bring him down. But Frank Parlato did just that, and he's not finished exposing Raniere's misdeeds. Parlato has unique access to victims and former NXIVM members who were in charge of hiding the cult's activities, some of whom have never spoken before. Now, Parlato will shed light on possibly the darkest NXIVM secret of all: the deaths of 4 women.
Hello? Yeah, her family never knew what happened to her. But we're gonna find out. My name is Frank Parlato, and I'm an investigative journalist. In 2007, I worked for NXIVM for 6 months. One of my jobs was to refurbish their image as a legitimate self-help group.
At one time, he was hired as NXIVM's publicist. NXIVM turned around and came after Frank, and he became a target like many others within NXIVM.
I was abruptly fired when I began to look into what happened to some missing money. The total was a little bit more than $90 million. I suspected that Keith Raniere had embezzled the money. Raniere wanted to destroy me. It was either me or him. So I became a journalist. My goal was to expose NXIVM. On June 5th, 2017, I broke the story that NXIVM was branding women under the direction of Keith Raniere. My current investigation leads me to believe that Raniere could be responsible for the deaths of Kristen Snyder, Gina Hutchinson, Barbara Jeske, and Pam K. Fritz.
Turn.
That was a beautiful turn.
Uh-oh.
In 1999, 31-year-old Kristen Snyder moved from Kentucky to Alaska. She was pursuing a career as an environmental consultant. By all accounts, she was a happy, well-respected member of her community. Snyder was ambitious. She wanted to improve herself and her career. That's when she discovered Executive Success Programs, also known as ESP. Frank Parlato is in Anchorage, Alaska, to examine the mysterious details surrounding the disappearance of Kristen Snyder. Parlato has arranged to get a copy of Kristen Snyder's police report from the Anchorage Police Department. On February 7th, 2003, they opened a missing persons case on Snyder. She was last seen at a local hotel where she was attending a self-help seminar. Witnesses stated that Snyder was forcibly removed from the class because she was acting erratically. When she did not arrive home later that night, her wife, Heidi Clifford, reported her missing. Kristen's pickup truck was found 2 days later in Seward, a 2.5-hour drive from Anchorage at the edge of Resurrection Bay. A letter inside the truck indicated that Snyder was planning to commit suicide. And on a separate sheet of paper, a note said, "No need to search for my body."
I'm going to meet Alan Nickel. He's an officer with the Seward Police Department. He was there on patrol the night she was missing, and he was looking for her.
You know, we responded out here, we looked around. You know, it was just incredibly foggy that night. We could hardly see right off the hood of the car. Found her car out here. Never found the body.
They never found her body.
No.
On the morning of the 8th, she disappeared on the 6th. The Millers of Miller's Landing Resort discovered a storage shed had been broken into and an old kayak was missing. The storage was close to where the vehicle was located. The theory would be, right, that she broke in, had a choice of kayaks, and she took one.
Yeah.
Paddled out in Resurrection Bay, deliberately capsized.
There's nothing in this that even says that she actually left in the kayak.
Is it fair to say it's also hypothetical that she committed suicide here?
It is, yeah, because it's unsolved. We don't know what happened to her.
We're gonna have to get down and do our own street-level investigation. So I'm gonna go through this police report, and I'm gonna call everybody on it. I'm gonna try for this guy, Kenny Powers. He's the friend of Kristen Snyder.
Kenny?
Hey, Kenny, Frank Parlato calling. How are you?
Good.
I'm here in Anchorage to try to ascertain a few details about Kristen Marie Snyder. I was hoping I could talk with you.
Certainly.
Thank you, sir.
I was the director of the ski patrol. Chris had expressed a lot of interest in search and rescue, so I was grooming her, if you will, to be the next search and rescue leader. Chris was a great person. Super nice, smart. She's a very close friend of mine. She was a stable person. This was so unbelievably out of the ordinary in terms of behavior for her.
What happened the day that she was last seen?
Heidi called me that afternoon and said, Chris walked out of the ESP seminar this afternoon, said something scary-ish, and left. And Heidi had not chased after her at the time, but when she got home a couple of hours later, Chris was gone. The ski patrol, which is a rescue organization, is like, we gotta find Chris. 30 Nordic ski patrollers out there looking, on top of the Alaska State Troopers, the Anchorage Police Department. There's a Coast Guard cutter, helicopters in the air, hundreds of people looking for Chris. It was like a police officer who gets shot, and the call goes out, you know, police officer down. And you don't get one police car that shows up, you get 20. And it was like that with Chris. She's one of us. And we're gonna try to find her.
By 2003, NXIVM training centers for ESP, the Executive Success Program, had been established throughout the United States, including Alaska. The courses attracted thousands of members who paid $7,000 each for an intensive 16-day self-development workshop. Why would Kristen Snyder, a successful professional who had invested so much financially, suddenly leave the NXIVM class? Snyder took her first NXIVM course in November of 2002. 3 months later, Snyder was already in the middle of her second 16-day course. On the 10th day of training, she was asked to leave and never seen again.
Every single word out of her mouth was NXIVM. She wasn't who she was. Search and rescuers usually find something. He didn't find a thing. Nothing. I want to know what happened. I want to know why we didn't find her. I want to know why they didn't care.
It's such a bizarre story. It doesn't, so many components of it sound so unreal, you know? The details following the disappearance are strange. So there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. I never talked about it at all until today.
Kristen Snyder was 35 years old when she disappeared in February of 2003. Her abandoned truck was discovered at the edge of Resurrection Bay, Alaska, with what appeared to be a suicide note inside. Before she vanished, Snyder was taking a self-help course called Executive Success Program, or ESP. Later, it would be known simply as NXIVM. A friend of Snyder's, who was taking the same course, has agreed to tell us what she knows. Out of fear of retaliation by followers of NXIVM's leader, Keith Raniere, she's requested that we conceal her identity.
Kristen took the class in November of 2002. For her to do this was like a huge undertaking for her to spend $10,000, $12,000 for the first class. When Kristen brought me in, it was very intense. And you're with 15 strangers that you didn't know at all. And then within a day, you're divulging your deepest, darkest secrets. Chris started tripping out, being quite vocal, quite distressed. And so I went to the leader of the class and said, I'm going to bring her to the Alaska Psychiatric Institute. They were trying to support her, and they would separate us intentionally. They would completely separate her having support from me. Whoever would be watching intently, they were just making sure that we were not together. I can't even remember anybody's name in that class. They just kept pulling her out of the room. That last time I saw her.
Do you have the suicide note?
So this is a copy of the suicide note. I attended a course called Executive Success Programs, AKA NXIVM, based out of Anchorage, Alaska, and Albany, New York. I was brainwashed, and my emotional center of the brain was killed and turned off. I still have feeling in my external skin, but my internal organs are rotting. I'm sorry, life. I didn't know I was already dead. No need to search for my body. Was this potential suicide letter in Chris's car coerced? Was it her willingly writing it? That we don't know.
But when I look at what's going on in the world, seriously, I feel it's not right, and something needs to be done. Someone has to do something. And if you want to take the next step, you'll need to take the initiative and sign up now to attend one of our introductory weekends.
Thousands of people took those courses. They really believed they were creating a better world. They were doing all of this out of the best intent, and some of the people who took courses maybe got something out of it.
You like to think about justice, but justice is something we earn.
They thought of themselves as humanitarians, and so they were doing all of this out of the best intent.
Keith Raniere students were largely educated. You know, they had jobs, they had decent careers, families, but they wanted to improve themselves.
So what you're going to see is how the anger covers the fear.
I really loved self-development workshops, goals programs. I loved that kind of an exploration.
The classes would be $2,000 or $3,000. Some members were in debt, you know, $200,000, $300,000.
The courses themselves seemed to be built like a pyramid scheme where, oh, that's great, you finished that training, but now you need this training, you need more, you need more, you need more.
In many cases, some of these young students, they were going to lose all their money, they were going to go into debt, they were going to become trapped, they were going to be forced into servitude. They were stuck.
There was a search here 2 days after she disappeared. It seems to me that it's not very likely that there would not have been a trace of Kristen Snyder. I don't know what the usual result of these searches are. I need to find out. How long have you been harbor master?
I've been harbor master since 2014. I've been with the harbor since '94.
Oh, so you've had some history with this water, right?
Yeah. No need to search for my body.
A search was conducted, and her body was not found. And that's why we're looking into this. You're fairly familiar with the waters of Resurrection Bay?
Yes, I am.
Say?
Yes.
And fairly familiar with what happens, evidently, to bodies when they drowned?
Pulled a few bodies out of the water since I've been working for the city.
And how many would you say you've searched for?
I believe 16.
What's been your success rate?
So we found every one. I would say 100%.
Harbor Master, Stewart Harbor Master.
You've always found the bodies. Kristen Snyder is the only body that hasn't been found.
Correct.
In order to get a better sense of the area, Frank Parlato has enlisted the help of a local helicopter pilot, a kayak expert, and the owners of Miller's Landing.
We are right here. This is Seward, and this is Resurrection Bay. So the coastline here is where typically people go kayak.
Sure, track downstairs, gonna take off.
So we're approaching another campground here on the right. That's Miller's Landing right there. That's where the kayak was taken from.
Now, you know this land around here, right, pretty well, because you've been here since the 50s?
Yeah.
This girl, Kristen, her vehicle was found here with a suicide note, and a kayak was missing from here. How did you happen to notice that the kayak was missing?
I do remember noticing that the grass where the kayak had been sitting was laying there upside down on the edge of the yard right next to the tree. It was obvious that it was missing because there was snow everywhere else except where the kayak had been.
Well, you know a bit about kayaks.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm just saying I don't
In my experience, I've been doing this for a long, I'm the old guy here in town doing this. The whole story doesn't make sense to me.
How troubling is the fact that nothing showed up? How odd is that, do you think, from your...
Extremely odd, extremely odd. Something would have eventually showed up in this bay. A piece of the kayak or a paddle. Where's the paddle at?
Paddles don't sink, right?
They're made not to sink. You don't want them to sink.
I can be at 2,000 feet and I can see one kayak.
There's no question that if the kayak or even the paddle was visible, if it was around here, it could be seen.
At first, when I heard that she committed suicide, my initial reaction was I didn't believe it.
What you can see from here, this is why I really needed to get up there. If there was a body visible, they would have seen it.
It's possible that Kristen Snyder committed suicide. But after Parlato's investigation in Alaska, he questions whether she ended her life in Resurrection Bay. Some local testimonies claim that if Snyder had killed herself in those waters, she would have left a trace. They would have found the kayak or the paddle. With dozens of people searching for her, someone should have turned up something. Frank Parlato's investigation shifts to motive. Snyder was last seen alive at a NXIVM class. He believes that those who knew Snyder through the NXIVM courses may know more. Kristen Snyder left a NXIVM training course in Anchorage, Alaska on February 6, 2003, never to be seen again. Friends and colleagues describe Snyder as an active, happy, and prominent member of her community, so they find it odd that she would suddenly leave the NXIVM course, make a 2.5-hour, 127-mile drive to Seward, Alaska, and kill herself by capsizing a kayak in the middle of the night. The only piece of physical evidence that links Snyder's death to a suicide is the note found in her truck. The kayak and her body have never been found. Equally strange, in January 2003, just weeks before Kristen Snyder disappeared in Alaska, she took an unexpected trip to Albany, New York, the headquarters of NXIVM.
I'm here to meet up with Susan Dones. For 8 years of her life, she was a head trainer for NXIVM in Tacoma, Washington. Being a friend of Kristen Snyder's and deeply involved in NXIVM, Susan might be able to explain to me if anyone would want Kristen Snyder dead. Going back to January 2003, she was in Albany. You absolutely saw her.
Yeah, oh yeah, and we chatted. She wanted to see the Albany Center.
Did she seem to you to be happy?
Yeah.
Was she acting at all psychotic, fearful, paranoid, crazy, anything?
No, I never saw her that way.
Did she ever meet Keith Raniere? And could she have done that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. My suspicion is that he might have even had sex with her. The other thing is that Keith did not like women being lesbians.
He did not like women being lesbians?
No. Being gay, period, was an act of defiance. Especially if you're a woman, it was an act of defiance. And I think for him, because he treated women as objects, if you're a lesbian, then you're not available to him. So could he possibly try to turn her? You know, it's kind of like a notch on his belt. If she was manipulated somehow into having some kind of sexual relationship with him, we know that this is a guy that will do evil things to women.
Here's a quick side question. Were you there when he said, "I've had people killed"?
I wasn't actually there that day, but that's my video.
In 2009, Susan lent a friend a camera to record a private conversation in Albany, New York, between Keith Raniere and other high-ranking NXIVM members.
You have accused, at times, people of ganging up, ganging up on you. In some ways, the company isn't as bad, or it wasn't as bad a situation as you thought it was.
Okay.
But I believe that the way this was done will destroy the company itself when it did not have to, which is the conundrum. Here's the thing. I've been shot at because of my beliefs.
Right.
I've had to make choices. Should I have bodyguards? Should I have them armed or not?
Right.
I've had people killed because of my beliefs.
Was Raniere exaggerating when he claimed he had people killed? Or was he somehow involved in Kristen Snyder's death? Keith Raniere positioned himself as a celibate monk. He was beginning to attract wealthy followers. If it got out that he wasn't a celibate monk, and that he was even trying to convert a lesbian to having sex with him, this would have imploded his whole operation. NXIVM routinely hired private investigators to look into anyone who criticized Keith Raniere. One of the things I'd like to do, there's a guy named Joe O'Hara, and he was working for NXIVM when they began their internal investigation into the disappearance of Kristen Snyder. But strangely, NXIVM did not begin their investigation into the disappearance of Kristen Snyder until 1 year after she disappeared.
He didn't do anything for a year, Frank. It was only when the story came up. That's the other thing that's suspicious. If he was worried about the fact that her suicide was a fake, why not investigate it when it happened? Why wait a year?
Why wait a year indeed? Why wait a year? Why would you wait a year?
Because the story hadn't hit the press. If you want to find out what happened, you investigate as soon as possible after something like this.
Okay, so that's a really big point.
That's a big point. I mean, another possibility, a distinct possibility, she's still alive. That, you know, there's no body, there's no proof she's dead. There's never been any way to know that she really is dead. She could have committed suicide a different way. She could have been an assisted suicide. We know so much more about Raniere in 2019 than we did in 2005. Okay, we've learned a lot more about him.
He's not a monk. He wasn't a monk then.
He wasn't a monk, and he's capable of very harmful behavior.
What would your advice be? Where should I go from here?
So now, you have to go back and look at every story and reassess it, because now we know more about him.
Did you ever hear the name Gina Hutchinson?
Yeah, it was another story that I heard a little about during the 15 months I worked there. Again, a suicide, an unusual suicide.
What was unusual about it?
It's very unusual that women use a 20-gauge shotgun to commit suicide.
In 2002, Keith Raniere was trying to gain the trust of Sarah and Claire Bronfman, heirs to the Seagram's fortune. During that same time, Gina Hutchinson began publicly alleging that Keith raped her when she was only 14 years old. Frank believes Raniere feared if Sarah and Claire heard about the alleged statutory rape of Gina Hutchinson, they would not financially invest in his business. In October 2002, Gina Hutchinson's body was found on the grounds of a Buddhist monastery in Woodstock, New York, an hour-and-a-half drive from NXIVM's headquarters in Albany.
We're going to the scene where Gina Hutchinson's body was found. Gina had a spiritual attachment to this monastery and to Buddhism. Story goes that Gina Hutchinson bought herself a gun, went to the property that we're about to go to, and shot herself in the head. This is the death scene, 17 years ago. At the time, police concluded that it was a suicide, when perhaps it may not have been. Did she bring herself here? Was this her doing?
Gina Hutchinson, she was my sister. Gina was always special. She was always super intelligent, very sensitive. She always brought in stray animals and was always very caring and compassionate. She was 33 when she died. It's all very suspicious. She was a very gentle soul. For her to even be that violent, to choose a method that violent, that concerns me. I met Keith the night that I found him in bed with Gina. Gina was just a baby. I heard a noise in Gina's bedroom. You know, I went down and opened the door, and I remember the Christmas lights from the tree flashing on the room was kind of dark. And I see this male figure trying to escape out the window.
In 1983, Gina Hutchinson was a spiritual, sensitive teenager. She met Keith Raniere when she was attending 8th grade in Albany, New York, where Raniere was living and running a marketing business, the precursor to NXIVM. Not long after they met, Gina's sister allegedly caught Raniere climbing out of Gina's bedroom window in the middle of the night.
I don't think when I caught them in bed together, it was even the first, time that they had had sex. I think the first thing she said was, don't tell Mom, like, promise you're not gonna tell Mom. She wasn't quite forthcoming right away. Eventually she told me that she was having sex with him and that he'd talked her into it. She was emotionally vulnerable. What 14-year-old isn't emotionally vulnerable? He was preying, basically, on all the girls in the community. He had a plan. His plan was to become a mentor figure, a teacher of these young kids.
Often when you counsel people who were, say, children of what you call abuse, the little child, some little children are perfectly happy with it until they find out what happened later in life, and then it's more society that abuses them than actually the parent.
He's like the spider in the web, pulling people in. Raniere used to love giving examples like having sex with children. Why shouldn't grown-ups be able to have sex with children? Why is the age of consent 16, 17, 18? Why can't it be 12?
In other societies in the past, like in Rome or whatever, the standards were completely different.
He's trying to normalize certain things that he wants to be normalized in his world. One of Raniere's longtime followers sent an email in which she told Raniere, "You can have my daughter." She was only 15 years old at the time. That to me like shook me to my core. Like I've seen horror upon horror upon horror in this case, but for some reason that took things to a completely different level.
If you get to
anything to Gina, what would you say?
What would I say to her? I would say, I'm sorry. I would say, I am so sorry that I let, once he went out that window that first night, he should have never come back in. I should have slammed that window shut. He should have never been let back in her life. You know, I just didn't recognize him for the monster that he is.
Keith Raniere has even said, I've had people killed for my beliefs or theirs.
In my opinion, if Gina Hutchinson publicly accused Keith Raniere, or if it became publicly known that he was a rapist, a statutory rapist, his organization would have been destroyed. In my opinion, he was a sex addict, he was a perv, he was a psychopath, and Gina Hutchinson was the one woman that could expose him as the fraud that he was.
Materialism and satiation are abuses of power in themselves. It's just a matter of finding where that abuse is applied, because it is an immoral transaction.
When Claire and Sarah Bronfman were recruited into NXIVM, that was clearly a pivotal moment for the organization.
The Bronfman sisters come from a very wealthy family. They're both the heiresses of the Bronfman liquor fortune. Without the money of Claire and Sarah Bronfman, I mean, the NXIVM world doesn't exist.
I was hired by NXIVM in 2006. I lasted about 4 months. Raniere had like a burning intensity, but at the same time, he was arrogant, he was haughty, he was a know-it-all. He liked to pontificate. He didn't want to hear what anybody else had to say. I did think he was evil, but I thought he was just financially corrupt. I specifically remember that he got $66 million from the Bronfman Sisters Trust Fund.
They believed that the money was being used for some higher purpose, but Keith Raniere blew through more than $100 million.
All the buildings, the facilities, the jet travel, the private speakers, all that costs lots of money.
Having that amount of money, they could now buy off people, they could file lawsuits against people, whatever it is he wanted to do.
Gina Hutchinson's autopsy and police report indicate that the 33-year-old committed suicide by placing the muzzle of a .22-gauge shotgun in her mouth and pulling the trigger. Frank Parlato wants to know if this extraordinarily brutal act is physically possible for a woman of Gina's build. With the help of a ballistics expert, Parlato will, to the best of his knowledge, recreate the last moments of Gina Hutchinson's life to look for any details the authorities may have missed.
You've read the autopsy report and you read the police report. It was an apparent suicide in Woodstock. Did anything strike you as possibly suspicious?
Both reports went with the assumption that it was a suicide. I think the one thing that's a little disappointing is the lack of gunshot residue test on her. Because whenever you fire a gun, you get gunshot residue on your fingers. And had they swabbed her fingers, we would know for sure that she was the one that fired the gun.
If foul play was suspected, what other tests do you think they would have done?
I don't think they did a wide scene investigation because they assumed it was a suicide. That goes back to when you have a theory and you just follow that one path, you don't look at these other things that might come into play. So
they would have looked possibly for footprints?
Footprints? Yeah, definitely. They would have looked to see, was there any evidence that the gun was actually fired in that location versus another location, which is why those crime scene analyses are so important right when they happen.
From what you know, is it odd that a woman would use a gun to commit suicide?
This is kind of a violent means for a woman to commit suicide. We don't see it as often as we do with men, especially with a shotgun, right? This is an exemplar shotgun. This isn't a real one.
It's the same size.
Same size, same length. And like I said, the length is critical because we have to figure out whether or not she would be able to put this in her mouth and pull the trigger. We have a nice person who's gonna help us out in terms of same height, same weight, wearing similar clothing, which is great because we really want to kind of have this be exactly how it happened. It has to be under the coat because that's what she was wearing and how she was found. The gun in her jacket.
Can she do it?
Like that. And then, can you reach the trigger?
You can't reach the trigger.
She could have used a twig or a branch to do it, but on her own, it doesn't seem like she can really reach.
It seems unlikely in this position.
Yeah, in this position. We can go back, we can try to recreate, we can speculate, but you're right, at the end of the day, we don't really have hard conclusions, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Gina Hutchinson was a minor when the 23-year-old Keith Raniere allegedly first had sex with her in 1983. He remained a dark influence in her life until she purportedly committed suicide at the age of 33. If the police hadn't immediately ruled Gina Hutchinson's death a suicide, at the very least, they could have interviewed Keith Raniere, who lived an hour-and-a-half's drive away in Albany, New York. Albany was NXIVM's headquarters, and it's where many of Raniere's most devoted followers flocked to be near him. It's also the next stage of Frank Parlato's investigation. Parlato is here to look into the deaths of the final 2 lost women of NXIVM, 63-year-old Barbara Jeske and 57-year-old Pamela Kafritz. Both women lived with Keith Raniere and were part of his trusted inner circle.
We are here at the border of Knox Woods, the subdivision where Keith Raniere lived for maybe 30 years of his life. And it was where all of his followers came. It's where Pam Kafritz lived the last days of her life and where Barbara Jeske lived the last days of her life. We're here to see if we can uncover any evidence surrounding their deaths. Unlike Gina Hutchinson and Kristen Snyder, these women did not die by an apparent suicide. These women all developed some sort of cancer.
Essentially, Keith had created an organization with an inner circle of primarily women around him.
As it grew, there were different people who became part of the inner circle, and that inner circle was people, to my knowledge, that were sleeping with him.
They all worked for him in some capacity. I saw complete mind control. I saw total blind loyalty.
Barbara Jeske was, she was more of an enroller and kept people in regards to going through curriculum and stuff. Pam was Keith's, like, #1 and lived with Keith the longest.
Some of the women who had been involved with Raniere through the years had some form of cancer, and some of it fatal. Raniere was directing what sort of treatment they could get. It was endangering these women and may have, in some instances, cost them their lives.
My name's Cindy Libertor. My sister is Barbara Jeske. And Barbara was very bubbly, friendly. Everybody loved her. She taught a lot of the courses. She got a lot of people into it. She made Keith a lot of money. I don't know where that money went, but she made him a lot of money. In the end, she saw the way it was spiraling and she wanted out, but by then it was too late. She got the diagnosis.
Keith Raniere's control over the women in his inner circle did not stop with sex. According to former NXIVM members, when he got them pregnant, he instructed them to have abortions. He also controlled their diet and medical treatments when they fell ill. Frank Parlato has arranged to meet with a source, a former Inner Circle member, at a house she shared with Keith Raniere. Barbara Jeske and Pamela Kafritz also lived here when they both developed and died of cancer. The source has agreed to meet with Parlato on the condition that she remain anonymous.
So this is the home of Keith Raniere?
Yes.
This was his headquarters, right?
Yes.
Now, it's not really a big house.
No.
So when did you move in here?
1988. Pam moved in within a year or so.
And then Barbara Jeske, when did she start living here?
So that would have been like early 90s. It's a bit more of a mess up here. So. Pamela lived in this room.
This is the master bedroom, right?
This was his and my room.
We have obscured your identity, not mentioned your name.
I asked that I not be identified for a couple reasons. There's the people that are still followers of Keith. And
so there's some
danger there. And I've talked to people who have been afraid for their lives even, you know. I obviously know enough of what went on with him that I think I would be a danger to them, and which makes them a danger to me.
Let's talk about Pam for a minute. Did you know Pam?
Yes. Pam Kafritz could be very sweet, very funny, uninhibited, I guess is a nice way of putting it.
But she lived with Keith?
Yes.
Do you have any reason to suspect anything suspicious about Pam's death?
There was a lot of cancer in that group of people who lived together. Pamela had kidney cancer. Barbara Jeske had brain cancer. Kristen Keefe had cervical cancer. So there was just a cluster of cancer going on there. That seems suspicious.
Do you know if Pamela had a will?
I had heard that she did.
Do you know who the executor of Pam Kafritz's will was?
I believe it was Keith Raniere.
Is there any chance that Keith might have tried to poison you and Pam and Barbara and found a way to do it?
That's a rough question. You asked me that a year ago, I would have said that's outrageous, ridiculous, it's against everything he stands for. But after everything we've seen this year, anything's possible.
After Parlato's interview, the NXIVM source reveals that she kept a lock of hair from the time she had cancer. She provides the filmmakers with the hair sample in the hopes that it may help inform Parlato's investigation.
This is the hair.
This is my hair. I had my hair down to my waist since I met Keith. And so when I finally got him to agree to let me cut it, it was a big deal, so I saved the tail.
Because that hair could be a key for us.
Frank Parlato needs to get the hair sample tested.
What What I'm going to do now is call Jason Kowalski. He is a forensic scientist who may be able to at least answer a question or two about whether or not an individual may be able to get another person to contract cancer.
Hello, this is Jason.
Hey, Jason, this is Frank Parlato calling. Raniere was a fanatic in many ways, and one of his fanaticisms was that hair represented an essential aspect of a woman's persona, and he did not normally permit them to ever cut their hair.
Okay.
If they did cut their hair for whatever reason, he would require them to store that hair to keep it and preserve it. One of the women who survived, the one that had the bladder cancer, had some of her hair from that period. Now, this would go back several years, but would there be anything in the hair that might permit us to make any kind of a test?
Absolutely, yeah. Hair is, oh my gosh, it's a phenomenal time capsule for toxins and exposure, environmental exposure. So if she cut a portion of some hair off and saved it from a period of time, maybe when she was exposed or even during the time that she had cancer, you definitely could test that hair and see what you could find.
We sent the hair sample that we got from an inner circle member of Keith Raniere's to a forensic scientist. He's been running some tests to find out if there was anything in her system when she was living with Barbara Jeske, Pam Cafords, and Keith Raniere. As far-fetched as it sounds, it is strange to me that 4 women living with Keith Raniere should all come down with cancer.
Come on in. There you go. Please have a seat.
Okay.
A lot of what I'm working on would be missing persons cases, advising laboratories on, cases that they're working on, cold cases, things like that. In this case, we have something a little bit different. We received that hair sample from you, and we had an opportunity to go and get it tested. And with that, I was able to divide that section of hair into 3 different strands. In an average number of people, this is the normal level of barium and bismuth. That barium and bismuth level is so significantly higher than the normal in all 3 of these samples that I'm going to be able to comfortably say that she was definitely had some type of a chronic exposure to these 2 heavy metals. And that look on your face is exactly right.
How would someone get bismuth or barium?
Barium is occurring in a variety of different sources. Higher concentrations, it's going to be found in things like gunpowder, explosives, electronic devices, but also found in rat poison, believe it or not. If it is rat poison, you're talking about a low-dose chronic exposure to this over 15 to 24 months.
This woman had bladder cancer, and the other woman that lived with her had kidney cancer.
Interesting. So I would say for both barium and bismuth, there's actually, within the literature, lots of references to renal system issues with high-dose exposure. The other thing with that is that we're still thinking about, and we're really trying to answer the question from your original conversation with me about the cancer, about what caused these women in this house at this time and place in history to all develop different forms of cancer. But we really just don't know.
Is it possible that Keith Raniere poisoned these women over a period of years? For those who knew him and the secrecy surrounding him and his inner circle, makes anything possible.
Come check us out. Let's get this ball on the road.
Pam is the one who went out and sought people and set people up for Keith. She was Keith's pimp for decades until she died. And then Allison Mack is the one who took over.
Allison Mack was an actress. She appeared in the television series Smallville. She was a very dedicated member of ESP.
She started out as just someone who was recruited through the Vancouver Center. Once she met Keith, became his second in command.
They then created Keith Raniere's secret master-slave order known as DOS, headed by Lauren Salzman, by Allison Mack, but ultimately Keith Raniere was the ultimate authority over this secret group of women who became his sex slaves.
DOS was the secret sorority for women where the branding took place.
DOS was the elite of the elite, and it gave some of the women special access to Keith and vice versa, but the cost of DOS is the branding and the humiliation and the pain.
Most women were surprised that the brand was the size that it was.
It can look like a symbol until you know what to look for. Once you've seen the photograph, yeah, it's K-A-R, Keith Allen Raniere. This is not what you do to human beings unless you think you own them.
Suddenly, NXIVM became an international story.
So many people were upset and leaving. People were coming out validating some of the accusations about things that were happening. Basically, they lied about it. And it wasn't just one person lying. It seems like it was a whole group of people lying to keep a cover in place.
I think it was interesting that when women were admitted to this secret circle of the cult, they were required to give blackmail material in case they ever got inklings of leaving the cult. So again, a person who's capable of that is capable of anything.
Frank Parlato, the journalist who first revealed that NXIVM was branding women, is deep into the next phase of his investigation. Could NXIVM founder Keith Raniere have played a part in the deaths of Kristen Snyder, Gina Hutchinson, Barbara Jeske, and Pamela Kafritz? In the case of Kristen Snyder, although her body was never found, Frank continues to search for new leads that could hopefully provide answers to the questions surrounding her death.
Chris is gone. This amazing person who was on this planet with good intention, doing great things, is gone. And all because of a class. Let's go back to 2003. Around the holidays, she decided to fly to Albany, New York. So Chris came back from Albany. She was very disconnected from some of the people around her, some of her joy and some of her laughter and some of what the character that Chris is and was seemed dampened. She was just not the same. If he has done what has been reported and on record of what he's done, if he invited her into his little sex den and this happened to her, I have no doubt that it was not, it would have been a non-consensual situation.
To do what?
To have sex with him.
Matt, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
I overheard and would be kind of in the room and privy to some conversations and some documents and some data that I don't think a lot of people had access to.
An important element of this investigation is to find out if Keith and Kristen had a relationship. Did they have an intimate relationship? And this is what Matt can hopefully shed a little bit of light on. You went to work for Claire Brofman.
I was hired on a security contract. So my contract with Claire was basically to do IT, information technology, and security. It was supposed to be a wireless sharing network, right? So the concept of the story is that basically Keith was like, hey, I want to be able to take cell phones, bond them together, have shared bandwidth, stuff like that. And they're asking to do what's called wireless mesh node networking. Wireless mesh node networking allows you to basically create your own internet. When you're basically building your own network at your house, you get to see everything that goes across, right? His real motive was to spy on everybody.
Spying his people.
That's what I know now. Crazy, right? So, and then finally, when we started asking ethical questions, we got kicked off the project. Shocker.
Did they ever mention the name Kristen Snyder to you?
Yes. A friend of mine had been asked to research into Kristen Snyder to see where she was.
So they told her, your friend, that Kristen Snyder was alive?
Yeah, the understanding is that they feel like she faked her own death and that she wasn't really dead. Maybe he killed her, or she faked her own death and escaped. Either extreme goes to show what kind of a monster it is. You know, Kristen Snyder, he had gotten her pregnant, right?
Keith Raniere.
We had known that Kristen Snyder had been pregnant with one of his kids.
How do you know?
Claire Bronfman, from Claire's mouth, from her words.
Claire Bronfman told you that Kristen Snyder was pregnant?
Yep.
Kristen Snyder was pregnant. Sheds a brand new light on this thing.
If it's true that Keith Raniere fathered a child with Kristen Snyder, she could have been a threat, especially if she had refused to have an abortion, as Raniere had allegedly convinced other women with whom he'd been intimate. Snyder's baby would be physical proof that Raniere was having sex with his followers, and even worse, that he could have been manipulating them into unwanted sexual relationships. Still, another woman had a child fathered by Keith Raniere. And unlike Kristen Snyder, she is very much alive. She escaped NXIVM and went into hiding. Her name is Kristen Keefe.
Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, good. Well, after all the people who've gone to such great lengths to discredit me, it'd be nice to, tell my story and that people know the truth about what I did. I found paperwork, and I didn't want to work there anymore because I thought, this is totally unethical. This is fraud. We can't do this. They're embezzling money. The taxes aren't being paid. And so I talked to the FBI, and they were like, well, what else do you have? So I looked through everything, and then I started connecting the dots. And I went to Homeland Security with the information, and they already knew, and they said, back off, or you're going to get killed.
Kristen Keefe is a mystery. No one's ever interviewed her on the record. She left Raniere and fled with her son, Keith's son, when he was 7 years old. Raniere kept Kristen Keefe so skinny and on such a restricted diet that nobody knew she was pregnant, including Kristen herself, until she was 8 months pregnant and unable to have an abortion. Now, finally, for the first time, she's ready to talk.
Kristen knew a lot. She knew of a lot of illegal activity.
Leaving NXIVM for many people was treacherous ground. If a woman impregnated by Raniere wanted to leave, you look at the case of Kristen Keefe. Ultimately, when she saw her opening, she just went for it.
Now, for the first time, Kristen Keefe will sit down for an on-camera interview.
My name is Kristen Keefe, and I was involved with NXIVM for 16 years, and Keith Raniere for 24 years. And I became the primary whistleblower. I left my house with nothing but my pocketbook. And I took a taxi to the police station. And while I was at the police station, the NXIVM attorneys found out, and the NXIVM attorneys called there and said, "We know she's there." And I said, "That's it, I can never go back." I knew they would put millions of dollars into finding me, grabbing me, doing whatever they could to take my son. I knew that when I walked into that police station, in Keith's mind, that was nuclear war. No one had ever done anything like that to him before. I knew I was being hunted like an animal.
And what would happen to your son?
Okay, let's stop. No, I don't want to talk anymore. Really, I'm done. I don't want to talk anymore.
NXIVM insider Kristen Keefe is one of the many women NXIVM leader Keith Raniere impregnated. Unlike allegedly dozens of others, she was not forced to have an abortion. When her son was 7 years old, Keefe escaped. Due to fears for her son's safety, Keefe is unwilling to discuss him, but she agrees to continue divulging what she knows about Keith Raniere and NXIVM.
Who'd you talk to? Who'd you go to? Who'd you confide in?
You know, initially no one. Everyone was against me. All the people that were against NXIVM were against me, and all the people that were in NXIVM or that knew about my departure were against me. And here I was coming with all this evidence and information and saying, all right, and no one would help me.
Do you think Keith Raniere was going to kill you?
No, he was going to kidnap me. I decided it was time to leave the moment that I realized that Keith was a psychopath. And it was undeniable. I was certain of it. Because I think he was absolutely, deliberately trying to destroy people.
Keith and Allison, January 9th, 6:59 a.m., talking about branding of the wall.
You guys did it and you weren't completely nude. You think the person who's being branded should be completely nude and sort of held to the table like a, sort of almost like a sacrifice? I don't know if that's a feeling of submission. And the person should ask to be branded.
Okay.
Should say, please brand me, it would be an honor or something like that. And an honor I want to wear for the rest of my life. I don't know. And they should probably say that before they're held down, so it doesn't seem like they're being coerced.
Okay.
We know the depth of our love through pain.
Right.
There is no other way in the human condition. It also, of course, videoing it gives collateral. Something that they say initially, although my body may be burned or tortured, my love is stronger.
In DOS, he did become violent because he mandated this torturing of women where he would brand his initials using a cauterizing iron. It would take 30 minutes. People would hold them down on a table and they would scream. They had no local anesthetic, and he would watch. In the end, Keith Raniere thought, you know, I am the boss, I can control women.
You had women who were basically forced, coerced to have sex with Keith, which they didn't want to do. You had women who were forced to take naked photos of themselves or have others take photos of themselves. You had women who were tied down on a board and had oral sex performed on them, blindfolded, not knowing who was doing it. People get paddled naked. These weren't like some polyamorous orgies. These were, in fact, terrifying, traumatic instances.
Kristen Snyder, when she disappeared, I was tasked with investigating what happened.
That was an assignment to
Yes.
go to Alaska.
Yes. Keith was like, I want you to go up there and talk to everyone. Then when I got up there and I started interviewing people, I started to question, this isn't adding up. Understand, when the whole thing first happened, the police didn't think it was NXIVM's responsibility. There wasn't a big investigation. The whole thing blew over like that.
Do you think the police did a thorough job in investigating? The Alaska State Police?
I don't think that anyone from Chris's family represented to the police at the time that they felt her disappearance was a result of the training.
What do you think is the ultimate truth about Kristen Snyder? Do you think she died? Do you think she's alive? Do you think she committed suicide? You had some time to think about this. You were deeply involved in investigating this.
I think that she did not commit suicide at that time. I think she's alive.
The only thing I'm pretty sure of is the official story is not real.
Right. Oh, yes, the official story is not real. There's a lot of questions that it would be great if they were answered. And I think Heidi knows something.
Heidi Clifford.
Perhaps the most vital witness in Kristen Snyder's disappearance is Heidi Clifford, Snyder's wife. She was present in the NXIVM training course in Alaska when Kristen was dragged out of the room. Heidi Clifford probably knows why that happened. She may also be able to provide a sample of Kristen Snyder's handwriting, a sample that can be compared to Kristen's alleged suicide note.
I've been trying to reach Kristen Snyder's wife, Heidi Clifford, for more than a month. She finally got back to me. I want to get a copy of Kristen Snyder's handwriting, something that we know she definitely wrote, so I can compare it to the purported suicide note. The only physical piece of evidence that we have that links Kristen Snyder's death to suicide is that one note.
Laura. Yeah. All right.
Does it start to get cold now? Heidi, I want to thank you for coming on camera and talking to me.
Heidi Clifford was Kristen Snyder's wife of 2 years. She was in the same NXIVM training course with Kristen hours before she vanished. Due to fear of retaliation by Keith Raniere's allies, she has up to this point only spoken to us on the condition of anonymity. Now, for the first time, Heidi has finally agreed to appear on camera.
I know you were a little reticent to appear.
Last week, when I first met with the director, I didn't even want my voice to be the same voice. I didn't want my face to be on the camera. I never talked about it at all until today. And I'm still scared. I've ran the last 15, 16 years of my life being scared of these people.
How do you feel now?
I'm still scared. It's still there.
What do you think happened to her?
I think Keith Raniere had inappropriate sex with her, which would have thrown her off her rocker. I think if she came home from New York in December, January, before the class that we took, and maybe she missed her period, and then that would have been like, oh, I am pregnant because I didn't have my period. So right about that time would have been about a month after she left Keith in New York. And I don't remember if it was that day at lunch or the day before. We had rings. And she took her ring off at lunch. And she said, "Can you hold this for me?" And I said, "I will hold it for you." And I put it in my pocket. And again, what we know about Keith Raniere NXIVM is if you are in a relationship with Keith, you cannot have a relationship with anybody else.
Did she ever tell you directly that she was pregnant with Keith's child?
When Chris was going through this 3 or 4 days of just kind of like a psychotic break, she reported to me that she was pregnant with Keith's baby. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? And then when I heard it more in the class, when she was yelling it out.
She actually told that to the class?
I yelled it. They just kept pulling her out of the room, pulling her out of the room, pulling her out of the room. And this is not just one time. There's just 3 or 4 times she was blurting this out.
Did you mention that Chris might have been pregnant to law enforcement and the Seward police, state troopers?
No, I was pretty much making sure that they weren't going to think I did anything to do with it.
Do you think the police did a good job investigating this?
Back then, there's no layers. Back then, it was just, Chris is not here, Chris is gone. That was it.
Kayak missing.
Kayak missing. That's it. Now, so much more information. There's so many layers to this.
Then you didn't point a finger toward
Not at all,
Raniere.
no, not at all.
Do you have any handwriting samples of Chris?
I was looking through my stuff today. I have like 1 or 2 notes, not a lot.
Even something could help us.
This is one of the handwriting. It's very little. Valentine's Day card. February 14, 2001.
Heidi, this has been extremely helpful. I think we're getting closer. They should be tested just to see if they're the same. We need to find out.
My name is Beth Chrisman. I am a forensic document examiner. I examine documents that have been called into question or have some type of maybe alteration to them. Typically, looking at suicide notes, it's about gathering enough handwriting from the person who allegedly wrote the suicide note and determining whether or not the letter formations, letter height proportions, slant actually match.
Beth?
Yes.
Hi. Frank Parlato.
Nice to meet you, Frank.
Nice to meet you.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
So what I did in this particular situation was I looked first at this question suicide note to determine, was it written consistently by one person? I looked at the card. The card is in a very beautiful cursive writing. I broke down each letter formation, stroke formation, and attempted to do the best comparison possible between this card and this alleged suicide note. And then that's where we came in with all the differences and the similarities.
Can you tell me, was the suicide note written by Kristen Snyder?
Kristen Snyder was last seen leaving a NXIVM training course in Anchorage, Alaska. Snyder's wife, Heidi, revealed that Kristen was shouting that she was pregnant with Raniere's child when the NXIVM trainers pulled her out of the seminar. Frank Parlato believes that the reality of her pregnancy could be the motive for her disappearance. Given the scale of the search for Snyder, the fact that nothing, her body, the kayak, or any other clues were ever found is deeply suspect. The only piece of physical evidence that seems to suggest Snyder committed suicide is the suicide note. If the note, or parts of the note, were written by somebody else, law enforcement may have no choice but to re-examine the details surrounding this case.
Can you tell me, was the suicide note written by Kristen Snyder?
In the card, she has a very distinct way that she writes her uppercase I. It's very unique to her. This is the way she makes her cursive I. And when she goes to write, or whoever wrote the alleged suicide note, they just wrote an uppercase I like we learned in first grade.
I mean, I think that's very fascinating.
Because we don't have enough known handwriting samples, I can't absolutely identify that the same person wrote both of these.
You can't say. You wouldn't say that they're the same.
I would not say they're the same.
Because it leaves the mystery unsolved.
It does.
When Kristen Snyder disappeared in 2003, the authorities quickly assumed it was a suicide. But after what I've learned in my investigation, and the first-person accounts of people who were there at the time of her disappearance, I have serious doubts that Kristen Snyder took her own life. My hope is that this investigation, which is not over, will assure that Gina Hutchinson, Barbara Jeske, Pam Kafritz, and Kristen Snyder will not have died in vain. And that everyone whose lives have been damaged by NXIVM and Keith Raniere will be able to tell their stories at last.
A year and a half before Frank Parlato began his investigation into the lost women of NXIVM, authorities arrested Keith Raniere in Mexico.
After the New York Times published a story, Keith Raniere was arrested along with Allison Mack, Claire Bronfman, Lauren Salzman, her mother Nancy Salzman, who was the president of NXIVM.
There were 6 people charged. 5 of them pled guilty. The leader, Keith Raniere, went to trial.
Keith Raniere's been operating a very dangerous criminal enterprise with his partner, Claire Bronfman, for 20 years now.
The government's case was clearly a boiled-down case. They proved every element that they went after. And I remember reading the testimony and thinking at one point, if this was a heavyweight fight, they'd stop it.
Self-help guru Keith Raniere has been convicted of running a sex cult where women were kept as virtual prisoners to service him. A jury took less than 5 hours to decide Raniere's fate. Raniere will be sentenced on the charges, which include racketeering, sex trafficking, and child porn possession, later this year.
This trial has revealed that Raniere, who portrayed himself as a savant and a genius, was in fact a master manipulator, con man, and the crime boss of a cult-like organization.
I would say that there is such a thing as karma.
There are other victims. Not all of them have come forward yet. There are still victims who don't dare talk about it, who are still scared to death, living with it.
He totally controlled people, everybody. The things that they would do for him were unbelievable.
Whoa, that was an alpine turn. That one just popped off.
I'm always hoping. You know what I mean? It's just like, knock, knock, and opening the door, and there she is.
In the end, Keith Raniere thought, I can dominate any woman. But in reality, it was women that brought Keith Raniere down.
There's part of me that feels humiliated about being involved in that. It's hard to explain, you know, that this was a bad guy and this was a bad organization doing horrible things. I just didn't know.
To find out that maybe some of the stuff that you were doing was helping to hurt other people is horrible.
Even as NXIVM has been brought to its knees, there are still people who are afraid of what they could still do.
I was very determined at a young age to understand spirituality, and I always thought that would be walking with God. I never thought that that might entail walking with the devil.